Greetings. For a while now, I've received a number of requests as well as messages asking me to offer my thoughts on the film, the documentary film Divorce Corp. And so this is going to be essentially a film review because I've finally taken the time to watch the film, offer my thoughts on what the film is about. I'll talk about the general thrust and gist of the film, as well as the good and the bad points, and there are good and bad points. The general thrust of the film, of this documentary film, Divorce Corp, and I'll post a link to the website in the low bar, is the corrupt nature of the American family court system. The primary focus of this film is on corruption. It does a very good job of explaining what happens in a divorce court, what the lawyers do, how the judges proceed, and it goes into great detail. You find out, for example, about the salaries of these lawyers. Some of these lawyers, many of them are earning hundreds of dollars an hour. One of them claimed he charged $950 an hour. And because the film takes a great deal of time going into the details of this, you really get a sense of why the system works so well at least for the judges and the lawyers. For example, why is divorce litigation such an ongoing process that can take years and years? So that's because lawyers are paid by the hour, and by drawing and dragging things out, lawyers make more money. It also goes into great detail on the nature of the corrupt court system itself. Judges that are essentially in cahoots with lawyers or on friendly terms with them. Lawyers who actually pay in to the judge's re-election campaign in order to curry favor with the judge, and vice versa, and so on and so forth. So the real strength of this film is in the highlighting of the corruption of the American family justice system, if you want to call it legal system, family court system. It also talks a little bit about other things, but I wanted to just mention that is what this film does. That's also its strength. In addition, it does mention the origins of no-fault divorce. Now, to many conservatives, Ronald Reagan, for example, is a great hero, a paragon of conservative virtue, although I do admit some conservatives admit that he is a failure and a phony and a fraud. And indeed he is. He's not a conservative. In 1969, Ronald Reagan, due to the appeals of the masses of feminists and women, introduced no-fault divorce that is 1969, in the great state of California. Notice my irony, the great state. So many fantastic things come out of California. And from California, no-fault divorce spread across the United States, due in large measure to Ronald Reagan kowtowing and essentially caving in to the demands of feminists and women. And the film does cite this, and it cites briefly the fact that divorce has gone up and that there's a 50% chance of a divorce, of a marriage ending in failure, and so on and so forth. But once again, the great focus of this film is on corruption. It does a really good job. You learn about the details, for example, of the family court system. It's not just lawyers, it's not just judges. You learn about these so-called family mediators, who technically speaking are supposed to be psychiatric or psychological professionals who are experts on family matters, but it turns out in the vast majority of cases they're not. They're people who might be credentialed in certain areas, but really have no clue about the inner workings of the family, and are certainly not in a position to use judging criteria against a particular parent. And they make a ton of money. The whole system makes a ton of money. And so you see the reason this film points out, and I think it's accurate, why the American family court system continues running the way it does is because it makes a lot of money. California seems to make the most money, a big surprise, off of divorce. It's such a shitty state, it really is. And if you, according to the film, the date of the film having been made, I think 2013, if you count all the states, the family court system will take in about $21 billion plus a year. Now, this is, of course, the strong suit of the film. It talks about in great detail the money, the fees to be paid to clerks. There's a rotating door service. For example, once you get something settled and there's another problem, the process needs to be begun anew, and so you need to pay the fees again, and so on and so forth. And as I said, it talks about no-fault divorce briefly, but one of the weaknesses of this film, I think, is that it paints a far too charitable picture of the system itself as being sort of gender neutral. It briefly mentions things like women earning more or less the same as men, and thus the idea of alimony being a bad one. It even cited, this is the show that I had mentioned a couple of years ago, Anderson Cooper, women paying alimony. And if you were to look at the film and not know anything about current events or the way society works, you would think, oh yes, both men and women suffer equally in divorce, and certainly financially they suffer equally in divorce. It paints a very sort of gender egalitarian view of divorce, that everyone suffers equally. In fact, they have what I think are extremely rare cases. In one case, a Tennessee school teacher who can't see her children. In another case, a woman who was very low income, who, according to the film, I don't think they're lying, has to pay alimony to her six-figure-a-year ex-husband. I think these are very rare cases. Never in the film, for example, is it mentioned that with the onset of no-fault divorce, divorces skyrocketed, and to this day, the vast majority of divorces are initiated by women. That is 70 to 80% in the developed world that we know of these divorces are initiated by women. They try to paint a very gender-neutral picture of the battleground of divorce court. They take, I think, rare cases such as this Tennessee teacher, this woman in Dallas, Texas, who has a below $30,000 a year income and has to pay alimony to the ex-husband. They also obviously expound upon cases with men. There was that famous Facebook case of the one guy who was forced to by a judge to offer a public apology to his ex-wife on Facebook, and another man who is serving jail now for 5 years for, to make a long story short, criticizing a judge, which was of course a further indication of the corruption in Indiana of the legal system in the United States in the context of family court. However, once again, the picture being painted is one that would, if you only knew this film, would tell you everyone suffers equally in divorce, and everyone is equally a victim, and the courts aren't playing favorites with women or men, and it's just the same. The filmmakers took rare cases with women and highlighted them, and I think tried to do so in order to present this egalitarian image. The other thing the film does, and I think they're obviously correct about this, they take the Scandinavian model of divorce, which is a kind of no-moneyed divorce, if you will, and cite it as something that should be possibly pursued as a model in the United States. And certainly, almost certainly rather, it probably is a better idea than the current model. In Scandinavia, be it in Sweden or Iceland, you do not have lawyers involved usually. You can't really make money out of the family court system, and at best it's a matter of a few hundred kroners or what have you, and it's really taken care of. And they also cite the fact that divorce rates are more or less identical in Scandinavia. They don't tell you who's doing the divorce. Once again, this film is very gender neutral. It paints both women and men as equal victims in the family court system. And one would get the impression that men and women suffer equally in the context of divorce. That said, I still think this film is valuable. You learn a lot about the inner workings of the court system, things I didn't really know. I didn't know much about these family mediators who get paid exorbitant amounts of money. I didn't know about the extremes of some of these billable hours of these lawyers. I mean, $800, $950 an hour. I didn't know about the levels of corruption regarding the judge. It is correctly pointed out in the film, for example, that in contrast to a criminal court, where a judge has to take into account and indeed abide to a larger extent by the decisions of a jury who are observing the plaintiff and the defendant, you don't have that. In a family court, you have one mediator, one judge, and there's a joke in the film where the I think it's the lawyer refers to the judge and says, well, every judge thinks of one word when he thinks of himself, God. So essentially the judge is a kind of deity, a deity of justice in this case, but they're so corrupt, it seems, and I'm not saying all of them are, but the way the film paints it, you would think that many of them are corrupt, and they can quite literally, these judges, within a course of a week, go from judge to lawyer to judge. It really, there's a lot of flexibility, and there's a ton of money in this. There is also a private investigator who probably researches or investigates infidelity or cases of infidelity, and he talks about the money involved, and he just says it's a business, and he doesn't have a problem with it. So the strength of this film, once again, is in the detail and depth of how financial corruption in the family court system in the United States. Obviously, it doesn't go into detail beyond Scandinavia, outside of the United States, and how things work there. I don't know the exact details, for example, of divorce proceedings in the UK, or Australia, or New Zealand, or Canada, and they might be somewhat different. We all know, though, that they can't be that much better, because people, specifically men, get raw deals there as well. The deceptive and problematic thing with this film is that it paints an egalitarian picture of an equal distribution of suffering in people in divorce. The vast majority of people who kill themselves after divorce are men. The vast majority of people who pay alimony, that is lifetime alimony, are men. The vast majority of people who suffer in the general sense from a divorce and deprivation of not being able to see offspring are men. The film, I think, intentionally takes rare cases of women who've been given the shaft and highlights them, and then presents this image of, both men and women suffer in equal measure. And of course it has to do that. It also is not at liberty of saying, well, the vast majority of divorces are initiated by women. My concern here, as someone who tends to be pro-male, obviously, is that some things are obfuscated in the film, and thus you're not getting a complete picture. You're not getting a complete picture of what goes on. And of course, we who are going our own way are completely unaffected by this. We're not foolish enough to get married. And so all of this is from the standpoint of observation. But men need to be aware, if they watch this film and they've never seen a video of mine before, or a Barbarossa video or a MGTOW video, that the corruption in the American legal system is certainly there, and I think it's an accurate portrayal, because I looked some of the things up that were mentioned in the film, and it seems to be accurate. But at the same time, suffering in the context of divorce and family court is not an egalitarian measure. There is no 50-50 distribution here. It is primarily, unfortunately, the domain of the male. It is the male who suffers more. And I'm just pointing this out. I'm not trying to say, find the greater victim. It's just a fact. Women tend to come out on top in situations of divorce, be it custody of the children, getting money, alimony, child support. That's another interesting thing they point out, that in the United States, in the context of the United States, child support is not based on the needs of the children, but rather on the income of the husband, well, not the husband, the parent, right? And it usually is the husband. They do talk about debtor's prison in the context of divorce. We know that's very real. There was that case that Barbarossa had cited several years back in Colorado. And so a lot of good things are highlighted in this film, but let's not be deceived and get the idea that divorce is just universally a bad thing for everyone. Women, generally speaking, profit a lot more from these legalistic procedures and the corruption than do men. Women are usually regarded as the people who have the quote-unquote best interests of the child in mind. They are usually the dependents financially, and thus get most of the alimony in most of the cases, as well as most of the child support. And it's pointed out that child support need not be spent on the children. So it's a pretty good film if you like numbers and understanding where the money goes and comes from and all of that stuff. It's actually a very good film. If you want an accurate portrayal of what is motivating people to get divorced, you're not going to get that. If you want to know who's doing most of the divorcing, you're not going to get that. If you want an accurate picture of who gets the raw end of the stick, or the short end of the stick rather. In divorce situations, you're not going to get that, because this film definitely paints an egalitarian sort of 50-50 situation in divorce, when we all know that women initiate the vast majority of divorces. They're the ones who pushed for no-fault divorce. Ronald Reagan granted it in the not-so-great state of California in 1969, and the rest is history. And to this day, it's still the majority of cases, men who are getting a really shitty deal in divorce and in marriage. So let's not pretend about that. Fortunately, once again, we're not affected by this, but this is essentially my review of the film. Good for raw numbers, not so good for an accurate portrayal of what goes on between the sexes. So everyone, thanks for watching. I'll check you guys out later. Take care. Bye-bye.